Hey there, 8th grade historians, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the absolute biggest turning points in human history. We're talking about a massive global shift that kicked off way back in 1492 when Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Americas. Literally, this one single event set off a chain reaction that completely rewired our planet's ecosystems, its economies, and its societies. We call this wild area of early globalization the Columbian Exchange. So here's our game plan for this explainer. 1. The Columbian Exchange. 2. Plants, animals, and microbes. 3. The movement of people. 4. Unequal consequences. And finally 5. Recap and transfer.
All right, Section 1, the Columbian Exchange. Let's define this massive global shift. So what exactly is the Columbian Exchange? Well, basically, it's defined as the two-way exchange of plants, animals, and diseases across the Atlantic Ocean, specifically between the Americas and Europe and Africa. You see, after Columbus's early voyages, the Atlantic Ocean stopped being this massive, impassable barrier and turned into, well, a really busy highway. And it's super crucial to remember this was a two-way street. The landscapes and the lives of the people on both sides of that ocean were about to change forever. Now, a really fascinating piece of this puzzle is the concept of commodification. Before Europeans showed up, native peoples used certain items, think tobacco or even a corn beer called chicha down in the Andes, purely for medicinal or sacred ritual purposes. But when Europeans arrived, they looked at those items and put a price tag on them. They essentially turned sacred ritualistic substances into commodities, goods that could be aggressively bought, sold, and traded for profit on a brand new global market. This completely flipped native economies upside down and really fueled the rise of early commercial capitalism. Moving right along to Section 2, plants, animals, and microbes. Let's trace these flows. If we look at this flow, you can literally map out who brought what. Europeans heading over to the Americas brought entirely new animals like pigs, horses, and cows. They also brought highly profitable cash crops like sugarcane. But silently and unintentionally, they also brought deadly microbes, smallpox, measles, mumps. Going the exact opposite direction, back to Europe and Africa, explorers took indigenous plants like tobacco and cacao, the bean we use to make chocolate. Also, the introduction of European tools like iron awls actually skyrocketed the native production of items like wampum shell beads, which were then traded back and forth across these new networks. But hey, this exchange wasn't just physical stuff crossing an ocean, it was intellectual too. I mean, imagine being a European explorer and running into a bizarre, slow-moving sloth or a giant manatee for the very first time. These animals simply were not in the Bible. It created a genuine philosophical crisis back home. People had to actually start observing the natural world directly with their own eyes to make sense of it all. Okay, time for our first pause check. Think about what we just covered regarding those strange new animals. How did the Columbian Exchange actually change European mindsets about the natural world? Take a second to think it over. So, if you said it sparked scientific observation, you hit the nail right on the head. Before all this, European Christians relied almost entirely on the Bible as the one true source of all wisdom. But seeing totally exotic flora and fauna in the Americas basically forced a massive shift in how they thought. They began to rely on empiricism, which means trusting their own direct observation of nature. Actually, cataloging all these crazy new plants is what gave birth to the modern science of botany.
All right, Section 3, the movement of people, the human exchange. Europeans pretty quickly figured out they could make absolute fortunes growing cash crops, like sugar and tobacco, over in the Americas. But there was a massive catch. Cultivating, harvesting, and processing plants like sugarcane was unbelievably labor-intensive, and honestly, highly dangerous work. This crushing demand for labor drove colonizers to frantically seek out a huge, incredibly cheap workforce to maximize their profits. And that brings us to our second pause check. Think back to those invisible flows of microbes we discussed just a minute ago. Why did Europeans begin bringing over enslaved African laborers instead of just relying purely on the indigenous people whose land they were already colonizing? The immediate reason is tragically tied right back to those microbes. Indigenous populations had absolutely zero immunity to the diseases brought across the Atlantic. The mortality rates were just staggering. To put that into perspective, between 1616 and 1618, epidemics wiped out up to 75% of the native people living along the New England coast. In some areas, half of the population died just from smallpox. This massive sudden population loss, combined with that insatiable demand for cash crop labor, meant colonizers turned to the brutal system of African enslavement.
To really wrap your head around the staggering scale of this forced movement, just look at this number, 350,000. Between 1672 and the early 1700s, the English Royal African Company alone transported around 350,000 captive Africans from their homelands. These individuals endured the absolute horrors of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, only to be trapped in shockingly brutal slave societies where they faced a lifetime of grueling forced labor.
Which leads us to Section 4, Unequal Consequences, a tale of three worlds. When we look at how this all played out, the outcomes were drastically different depending on who you were. Europe generated immense wealth. They got to enjoy new globalized diets, they developed empirical science, and rapidly expanded their empires. But on the other side, indigenous communities suffered unfathomable loss. Beyond the devastating diseases, all that social trauma led to things like mourning wars, which are conflicts fought specifically to take captives to replace their deceased loved ones. Plus, European demands for luxury items like beaver-trimmed hats led to such intense overhunting that beavers were driven to near extinction in areas like New England, which completely destroyed the wetland habitats that lots of other animals relied on.
And the contrast is just as stark when we look at Africa. While Europeans were busy enjoying their brand new luxury consumer goods like drinking hot chocolate and smoking tobacco, this new consumerism was directly paid for by the suffering of Africans. The real-world consequence for Africa was the utter devastation of local communities through the slave trade, the horrific trauma of the Middle Passage, and the brutal daily reality of chattel slavery on American sugar and tobacco plantations.
Finally, Section 5, Recap and Transfer. Let's put it all together.
Okay, here's your rapid-fire recap. The Columbian Exchange was a massive two-way movement of plants, animals, and diseases across the Atlantic starting in 1492. It turned sacred ritual items into heavily traded global commodities. The consequences were deeply, deeply unequal. Europeans gained staggering wealth and a brand new scientific way of observing the world, while indigenous populations faced devastating disease and severe environmental destruction. And ultimately, that massive European demand for cash crops drove the horrific transatlantic slave trade, forcing millions of Africans into brutal labor.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with this transfer question to really chew on. Think about everything we just talked about today. How do the trade networks sparked by the Columbian Exchange compare to the globalized supply chains and the rapid spread of diseases we see in our modern world today? Because, honestly, the history we explored today isn't just stuck in the past. It literally set the blueprint for our deeply interconnected and sometimes deeply unequal modern world. Thanks so much for joining me on this Explainer Historians. Keep observing, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.